Yeah, as mentioned, my name is James Luterek. I am a senior engineer here at Commerce Tools. I've been working in the e-commerce space for going on 17 years now, working from everything with small startups all the way up to large enterprise and global brands like Ulta, Express, and AT&T. So as I mentioned, I work for Commerce Tools. We are a leading commerce platform, kind of pushing that headless commerce space. And today I want to talk about GraphQL. So GraphQL, it's a tech concept, but I think it's important for everyone in e-commerce to understand what it is, where it came from. And specifically at the end, we'll talk about the benefits that it could have on an e-commerce business and why it's important. So even if you're not, a programmer, developer, an architect, you can see why you should be asking questions about GraphQL when you look for your next e-commerce solution or when you're building out your next feature. So yeah, here's the agenda for today. History of GraphQL, a little bit on the GraphQL language itself, some bonus features that I think are pretty cool. I will compare it to the industry standard API, which is REST. And then finally, we'll go over those benefits that I mentioned. So I think it's important with any buzzword that's out there, and that includes GraphQL, to really understand where it comes from, what its origins were, and what the creators were originally trying to solve. Because we probably face the same problems, and it gives us insight into how this tool is important. So GraphQL originally came out of Facebook. It was around the time where the iPhone was taking over, mobile adoption was through the roof. And if you talk to Facebook and listen to Zuckerberg, he'll openly admit that avoiding the mobile application market, investing too much in websites, and not decoupling his back end from his front end was one of the biggest mistakes that Facebook made. They waited entirely too long to make that move. They were pushing heavily on a mobile website. And if you know anything about Facebook's tech stack, it's all built in PHP. It's all server rendered. So everything's happening on the server, getting passed down to the browser. And it just wasn't giving the performance required on these mobile connections. And again, this is now over a decade ago where our mobile connections were not very strong. We're not talking about the things of today where they're as fast as our Wi-Fi. We're talking about where it's a crawling speed, depending where you were in the country or in the world. So they started on the process of decoupling that UI layer, that mobile app, and their backend services. And they started with building out new REST APIs and saw that even with REST, because you're passing an entire data set in one call, it still felt very slow. They wanted something more robust to build better customer experiences, and they wanted it to be even faster on those mobile connections. So that's where internally they invented a completely new system, which they internally named GraphQL. And, they did that within Facebook back in 2012. The developers that started building it have done many talks. You can find them online where they talk about its inception, and they thought it was this great thing, but they didn't know how to share it with the world. As they say, no one wants a whole spaghetti plate of PHP code that there was no way to integrate into your own solution. But after talking with some experts and working at it internally, they said, you know what, instead of trying to push out code into the world as open source, let's just release the specification of GraphQL. Let's just let everyone know how it works, and then they can build it themselves. So in 2015, Facebook released the spec for GraphQL. Later that year, Commerce Tools, the company I work for, released the first GraphQL endpoint for commerce and pushed that out so that e-commerce companies can take advantage. Following along, anyone that was following that space knows that there were some open source licensing issues with Facebook back at the time, where they had some clauses saying if you use their stuff, you could never sue them. But all of that's been resolved in 2017. So you don't have to worry about any of that. The spec is fully open source. It's ready to go and ready to be adopted. And in 2019, GraphQL Foundation was officially formed to help manage the language, to help organize the tools, and kind of push GraphQL forward in the marketplace. So let's talk a little bit about that marketplace. Got a few stats here. This first one is from a programmer survey called the State of JavaScript. And one of the questions they ask is, what do you think about GraphQL? And you'll notice the light blue on the bottom, that's the I've used it before and would use it again. So that line is continuing to grow. As people adopt GraphQL, as they play with it, as they add it to their solutions, they realize it's a great tool and they want to keep using it, they want to keep consuming it, and they want it for their next project. The next blue one is I've heard of it and I would like to learn it. So that's always been increasing. This past year, that actually went down a little bit. And I think that speaks to the maturity of GraphQL in that, we're leaving the hype cycle where it's no longer this marketing buzzword that everyone needs to throw around, but no one really knows what it is. Instead, it's becoming a mature, well-known thing that people are using to actually solve problems, as opposed to just some tech thing that programmers get excited about and the business sees no benefit. And that's that adoption curve as well. But the group that says, I've either never heard about it or I've heard about it and don't want to use it is always shrinking, and it's the smallest of the groups out there. By far, people still are very excited about GraphQL, and if they've used it, they want to keep using it. Another stat just shows the most popular GraphQL library for NPM, and just shows the number of downloads that are going on. And it shows that constant increase in usage over time. From when it first came out to now, it's just continuing to grow. And this is one of many GraphQL libraries out there. So it's not comprehensive. The last thing I want to talk about the landscape is that GraphQL Foundation actually keeps a landscape website that I recommend everyone go check out. It's over at landscape.graphql.org. And it highlights some of the best projects around GraphQL, services that are using it, databases with built-in integrations, and then any adopters of GraphQL that submit their website to this foundation and say, please list me, I'm a big user of GraphQL. So if you look at the projects on this, it's across multiple languages, it's across multiple industries. And if you look at the adopters, you'll notice that there are a lot of e-commerce companies in there that are making good use of GraphQL. And I can say from my time at working with commerce tools that this is definitely not exhaustive. Most of our customers are finding great success leveraging GraphQL, even though they're not necessarily listed on this screen. But it gives you a good idea of kind of who's playing with it right now. And you can go check out their mobile apps, their websites, and see if you can see the performance that comes with it. So I've talked a lot about the history of GraphQL, where it came from, but what is it? I mean, with any buzzword, there's a lot of opinions out there. There's a lot of people giving wrong answers. So what is GraphQL? It's a specification. It is a query language for APIs, ways for computers to communicate with computers at the code level. It's a specification for the servers to execute those GraphQL queries. And it can be a thin API and routing layer, which I'll talk a little bit more about later. What is GraphQL not? It is not a database. There's a lot of buzz about graph databases and how those are going to change things. That's actually not related to GraphQL. So it's not a database. It's not any type of storage engine at all. There's no requirements if you adopt GraphQL on how you build your actual tech stack. It's not a specific library. In the early days of GraphQL, the Apollo library and server implementation, it ruled out there. It was one of the first ones that was feature complete. Everyone was adopting Apollo. And for a while, it was synonymous with GraphQL. But now there's libraries for every single language, every single platform. You know, whether you're running any software stack, you can find a way to integrate GraphQL into it. So it's not a specific software package. It's just that spec that helps build multiple software packages. And it's not specific to any programming language. I mentioned a lot of JavaScript stats. I just am a JavaScript developer, so that's where I live. But here at Commerce Tools, our GraphQL endpoint's built in Scala, and we've helped create the open source Scala packages for GraphQL. I know that other platforms out there have GraphQL implementations as well in PHP and Python and other languages. And remember, I mean, Facebook built it first and they were PHP shops. So there's no specific language you have to use or platform if you're using GraphQL. So enough of the history, enough of the high level. For those other tech people out there, let's talk a little bit about the code and what it looks like if you're trying to use a GraphQL API. So the first thing we'll talk about is a GraphQL query. A GraphQL query basically says, I want to retrieve data from that GraphQL server. I'm going to ask for some information and work on getting that response. And if you're familiar with a REST API, you know, when you ask for a product or a list of products, you just hit a specific endpoint and you get back that list. With GraphQL, you actually specify the exact fields that you want. So you never get anything extra and you never get anything you asked for. In fact, the spec says that the response from the server must match your request exactly. So if the only thing you ask for is the total number of products, the only thing you're going to get is the total number of products. And that's part of the secret on its performance with low bandwidth, low connection speeds. The next thing for a GraphQL query is arguments. You know, it's great that you can start asking for generic data against your GraphQL server or against your e-commerce platform, but you're probably going to want to pass in some information as well. You know, in this example, I'm passing in a limit. I don't want every single product that's out there. You know, some e-commerce sites are running tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands of products, and that's just too much. You probably want the first 5 or 10 or 20 to start building out that page. So you can pass in these arguments, and it shows that syntax where you have the argument name and then the value that you're passing in. So this might be a limit to the number of products. Maybe it's your product ID to get a specific item, your cart ID, your customer's email to get any profile information that might be in there. But this is the purpose of those arguments, is passing these values into the server so you're getting specific data instead of generic data. Next up is this concept of aliases. And the idea of an alias is you're naming the thing that you're asking for. You know, you're giving it a name when you ask the server, and the server is taking that name and attaching it back to the response. And that name could be anything. You know, product one, ASDF, any string you want to throw in there could be your alias. And the question I get is, why do you need an alias in the first place? And the reason is, with GraphQL, you can ask for multiple resources in a single request to that server. So in one round trip from your application up to the e-commerce platform, you can ask for lots of different data points. In this case, the screen is showing that you can ask for 2 different products with different IDs. And when they come back, you're going to want to know which item matches to which request. So that's where this aliasing comes in. Anyone that's been building single page applications and played with the Apollo client for React or Vue might have realized that it does some cool background processing for its asynchronous queries, where if you tell it that you don't need the response immediately, it can actually go and batch up all the things that that website is asking for and send them in a single batch to the server to try and speed up the application and minimize the number of calls you're making in. And it leverages this aliasing automatically to make sure that it gets the right data and then sends it back to the right point of your website. So, if you're loading a page that has product information, maybe a mini cart in the upper right, maybe it says, "Hello, James, welcome back." So you have to get some user data as well. You can ask for all three of those things in one call and know exactly where to put it on the page. Next up is fragments. Fragments allow you to be more dry with your coding, allows you some reuse. And the idea here is if you have a list of fields that you're asking for every single time, why not list them once and reuse that list over and over again? And that's exactly what a fragment allows you to do. So for products, maybe every single time you get a product, you want that name, that description, and you want to know what version you're on. Well, you can put that in a fragment and shorten your code up. So now when you get the two, you're just putting in that fragment and then you're specifying what those fields are. So it's a great way to shorten your code, especially when you're dealing with lots of different queries and you're reusing that field list. And any code specification is not complete without variables. When you start playing with GraphQL, it's great to be hard coding everything and learning how it works. But when you build your full application, you're going to want to pass in variables. You're going to want to have a placeholder for that product identifier so that it can come from the URL slug, as an example, or some other way to pass it in. That's exactly what variables do. It lets you set up these items and swap them in as you're passing it into the server. And then the last feature of GraphQL queries is this idea of directives. Directives allow you to actually change the query based on something else that's going on. So here we have a variable. We've just got a Boolean called showDate. And with that, we have this directive called addInclude. And addInclude says if that Boolean is true, then we're going to include these additional fields. If it's false, we'll leave them off. Not really a real world scenario. In honesty, I haven't found too many uses of directives, but it's good to understand that they're there. If there are any other JavaScript programmers watching, it's worth calling out that everything in GraphQL is actually typed. So you can see that that showDate variable is marked as a Boolean. And the exclamation point in that syntax means that it's a required item for passing into that query. The other thing I want to point out, I'll move back a little in the slides, is that while the response coming from a GraphQL server tends to be JSON, so on the right you'll see JSON code, the query language itself is not JSON. It's close enough that you think it's JSON and you feel like it should be JSON, but it's far enough apart that as you're first learning it, you have to remember to delete some quotes or get rid of some commas. So it's just something to watch out for as you go. So that's your GraphQL query. It's everything you need to ask for data from the server. In GraphQL, you only have two things. You have GraphQL queries and you have mutations. Whereas other protocols have inserts, updates, and deletes, GraphQL, you just have the two. You got query and mutation. So anything that changes data is automatically a mutation. Should also call out that whereas other APIs might use the different HTTP verbs, GraphQL, everything goes through a post because you are asking for certain information. So you have to pass something in, either that query or mutation, and then you get your response. A mutation looks very similar to a query, so I won't go into it in extensive detail. And each implementation might be slightly different depending on how they handle mutations and updates. Here at Commerce Tools, we do everything through update actions, where you specify exactly what you want to change about that data point. So I have an example from Commerce Tools where we're updating the order state. So you can see that we have to pass in a few variables, the order ID, the new state that we want to set that order to. And in Commerce Tools, to make sure that there's no conflicts, we use versioning. So you have to pass in the current version to make sure that some other system, website, management tool hasn't updated it while you were waiting. So you have those three variables getting passed in. And then with mutations, you also have the opportunity to ask for fields back. So here I'm saying, hey, after you make this change, can you send me back that order ID and that order state so that I know that it was, applied successfully, and I can display that back to the user. So that's all pretty basic stuff on the GraphQL side. So let's talk about some of the bonus features that come with GraphQL and partly why it's become so popular. The first is a very technical concept called introspection, but you boil it down and you can say that GraphQL endpoints are self-documenting, because you can pass in a specific query that you say, give me the schema of this endpoint. And it will tell you about itself. It will tell you all the data that you can get out of it by passing this in. If there's a product list, it'll tell you, oh, you can look up products or orders or customers or carts or whatever that happens to be. You can find that out through this introspection endpoint. And the tooling around GraphQL takes great advantage of this. No one's manually typing in this schema request. Instead, they're leveraging it through the tools that come with it. They're leveraging it for things like validation, where you can have linting set up in your code base and make sure that errors are caught before they ever make it to the customer. Or that it'll actually correct things as you're typing in your IDE to make your developers faster, make sure that they're more efficient as they're making changes and building new features. It can also be used for code generation so that you don't have to write everything yourself. You can generate things off of this schema. And as I said, it's self-documenting. So there are plenty of tools that will use this to build out great documentation that you can view. One of those tools is called GraphQL. That's GraphQL. And it's a great open source tool. We use it here at Commerce Tools. We offer it as a playground for all of our customers, or you can download a standalone version or install it into your own GraphQL server for accessing your data. And one of the cool things about it is when you go into this GraphQL interface, on the right-hand side, it tells you everything about the endpoint. You can just click through and find out everything you need to know about that GraphQL server, what you can request, what variable there are, what those variable types are, and kind of go in that direction. And then you can start writing your queries or mutations right in that GraphQL tool. And it uses all of that data to actually do autocomplete as you're typing. So you can just start, with a few letters and it'll fill in the rest for you as you go, which is a great feature. And if you make a mistake, it's going to go ahead and let you know. It'll underline those mistakes with some validation, and it'll give you suggestions on what maybe you meant to fill in instead. So you can just point and click and figure out what you really want. So really powerful programming tooling. Definitely, elevates you to the next level as you're building out your system. I think one of the most unique uses of this schema definition and this introspection server that I've seen is this tool called GraphQL Voyager. And it's kind of hard to read the URL up there, but it's apis.guru/GraphQL-Voyager. And it's a really neat tool. You go to the website, you say, hey, I'm trying to use this GraphQL endpoint. And it says, okay, run this query and tell me what the results are. So you paste the results in, and it creates this cool mapping of the GraphQL server where it shows you all the objects. And anyone from the relational database world can look at this and see the power of seeing all these objects side by side, the relationships between them, and kind of get an understanding of that data model. And right there in the browser, you can actually go and explore that data model in deeper definition. And you can click on things and it'll take you to that next step. So you can really get a high level view of what that platform is offering. Next up on the really cool features I've been seeing is GraphQL as an aggregation service. Anyone that's building enterprise or even mid-level e-commerce solutions knows that you tend to go for this composable commerce approach. There's no platform that does everything perfectly. It just doesn't exist. So even if you sign up for the best commerce platform out there, you're still going to probably want some kind of tax provider here in the US because we have crazy tax codes, or you're going to want to integrate with your payment provider to make sure you can accept those payments. Maybe you want to have a more robust search. So you're leveraging Algolia or Constructor for your search endpoint and give your customers, that next level experience. Or at the very least, I think all of us are trying to push our marketing forward to the next step with personalization and machine learning and how can we do better product discovery. So more than likely, everyone at this conference, if you're running an e-commerce shop, has more than one service already running. And GraphQL can help with merging all of those services into one single endpoint to then serve up to all your different customer experiences, to your website, to your mobile application, and more. And GraphQL is designed to do this by default to the point where this aggregation service, this GraphQL server, can actually merge different data points and find the connections within them, even if they're coming from different sources. So, maybe your commerce provider has some product details and your search has a limited set. It can actually merge those together. So you can do a search and then get the full product detail coming out of that final endpoint with your keyword search. So this is a great way to kind of simplify your tech stack if you find that you need to. Depending on which commerce provider you're using, you might lose out on some of the benefits. If you're using something that's fully hosted, well, now your aggregation service might end up being the pinch point or the slow point of your final solution. So you might lose on some of that performance benefit or that uptime guarantee. So it's kind of a push and pull depending on where you want to go with that final solution. So what's the deal? We've been using REST for a long time now. Most of my career, I've been using REST. It's by far the industry standard. Should everyone run out and throw away anything they use that has a REST endpoint and start over with GraphQL? Does it fully replace REST? In my opinion, I don't think so. I think the API space is large enough to have multiple API protocols that serve specific purposes depending on what you're doing. And we can look at the two options and figure out where they make the most sense. Looking at a REST API, common practice, get your product by ID, and your response gives you everything about that product. Anything you wanted to know or that's stored about that product comes back as part of the REST API call. So pros, industry standard, everyone knows how to use it. Almost every service out there right now offers a REST API. It's very well understood. It's also very easy to cache. So if you have performance problems, you can quickly cache it because every request and response looks the same. Every time you ask for product 1, 2, 3, you get the same response. And it uses those standard HTTP methods, get, post, put, delete, which again helps with the caching and the optimization. On the con side, you're getting a lot of overfetching. You ask for a product and it's going to tell you the last time it was modified, or maybe who was the last person to edit that product. And you definitely don't need that to generate a product page. The end customer doesn't care. If you're creating that mini cart at the top right of your page and you ask for your cart, you're getting every possible detail about the cart. And really, you just need a few data points to say you've got 5 items in it valued at $100. So you're constantly asking for too much data and slowing down your entire website. You also have a lot of underfetching. Earlier in the talk, I threw out that example of if you want to generate a full page with your account information, your cart information, your product information, that might be 3 REST calls. Whereas with GraphQL, it's just 1. And depending on who you work with, I won't call out anyone by name, but there are places where there's a really tight coupling between the API and the user interface. And so that restricts you on what you can build. A good example is there are some e-commerce software systems out there that have very specific expectations on the checkout flow. You know, it expects you to do shipping information first, then billing information, then, finally a customer review of the order, and then finally checkout. So you have to do those 4 steps, and they have to be in that order. Otherwise, it just fails. And that tight coupling doesn't benefit anyone. What if you want to do a one-click checkout? Then you want a lot of flexibility on the API side to be able to do everything from I see the product to I've got an order in a single API call. So you want to avoid that tight coupling. It can be, it's not inherent to REST. Here at Commerce Tools, we can follow both of those flows. So depending on the REST server you have, you don't necessarily have this tight coupling, but you have to watch out for it as you go at these REST APIs. And unless the service you're working with has really robust and well-built documentation, it can be a little bit ambiguous. You don't really know what the product information you're going to get is until you make that request and ask for a product. By contrast, a GraphQL API, you tell it exactly what you want. It sends it exactly back the way you expect it in that order with those fields. So pros, introspection, gives you amazing tooling, self-documenting, that less data getting passed back and forth, really helpful on things like mobile connections where you have to worry about bandwidth, or if you're a global company where, depending where your user's located, they might be out in the country with a poor internet connection. Multiple queries in a single HTTP call. So again, you're getting all the information for a single page in one shot, speeding up the performance of your website. But on the con side, it's harder for the server. It's got to process this, and it has to go through and, actually match it exactly. So there's a little more complexity there. It's difficult to cache. And if you're already going with a microservices approach, it does diminish that shared architecture. And it can be a higher learning curve. So oftentimes my recommendation is use GraphQL for anything customer facing. Anything where your customer is interacting, that's where you want GraphQL, because you want to enjoy that speed and you don't know their connection. If you're doing some things like background syncing, GraphQL is a great option, but it might make more sense to use a REST API if it's offered. So here's my quick summary on what you're getting with GraphQL. Speed is probably the #1 benefit. That's literally why it was invented over at Facebook. Development, your #2 benefit. It's going to lower the cost of building new features. It's going to make your developers happy. It is ready today. It is no longer a new technology. It's been out for years. The adoption is high. It is fully baked, and the tooling is out there. And so next steps is to check if your current commerce platform already offers GraphQL, or if you're looking to make a switch, consider making that one of your requirement points for your next implementation. And if you want to know more about GraphQL and commerce specifically, our Chief Product Officer, Kelly, actually wrote a book. So you can get that deep dive of GraphQL. I threw up 2 URLs. This is the full URL that tells you exactly where to go. It's a little lengthy, so I also threw up a bit.ly URL so that you guys can screenshot it and type it out real quick.
Oh, thank you for this amount of information. I think people with technical skills can have some questions here. So I'm not a programmer, so I can only ask. Maybe you can tell us how do you see the future of e-commerce from the technical side?
Yeah, absolutely. I see the future of e-commerce being that companies need to meet customers where they are and where they want to shop. You can't expect the customer to go into work on Monday morning and go to your desktop site anymore. It started with mobile apps, but now you're seeing social commerce. You're seeing, integrating websites with in-store experiences, and you're really getting this omni-channel approach. And so what I see is that you need to be ready to decouple. You need your server and your data in one system, but it needs to be able to power all of those different experiences for your customers. So that's where that decoupling comes into play, where you have one server, one application that's tracking all of your data, letting you manage your customers, products, and so on. And it's connected to, every possible idea you could have on how to interact with your customers and help them shop where they are when they're ready. So that's definitely where I see the future going. And I think APIs is going to be the underlying technology that makes all of this possible.
Yes, yes. And we're speaking about metaverse today. And what do you think about metaverse? When will e-commerce come to metaverse? And will it be? When will it be?
I don't have a crystal ball to tell you the exact date. I wish I could. I'd be a much smarter man. But I see with a lot of, cool tech innovation and new things out there is that commerce companies and marketers will push selling into it as soon as possible, and then it'll bake for a little while. And then those of us that aren't early adopters will get in a year or so later when it's actually useful and making sales. So that's my prediction, is that it's going to be there and no one's going to use it at first. They're going to be like, this is silly. It's just a buzzword. We shouldn't care. And then a year or two later, everyone's going to care and everyone's going to have to be there ready to sell. So
like it always happens.
Exactly.
So thank you for your speech, James. It was nice to hear you. We will meet you at our other events, I think.
I hope so.
Yeah. Thank you very much, and have a nice day.
Thank you, everyone.